The most amazing thing is that we've probably made more progress in advancing the gospel around the globe in the last 50 years than in all the time up until that point in history. So we've just lived through the most incredible advance of the gospel in history.
The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership between 1615 and Missio Nexus, who have a shared passion to mobilize the people of God to be a part of His mission.
Well, hello and welcome once again to the Mission Matters podcast. I am Matthew Ellison, and you all know what I'm going to say. I am joined by my good friend and co-host, Ted Essler. Ted, greetings.
Greetings, Matthew. How are you doing?
Doing well. So good to be with you as always.
We're really blessed to have Rebecca Lewis with us. I don't know a lot about Rebecca, but I know one important fact, and that is she is the daughter of Ralph Winter. And this year we're spending the Missio Nexus annual theme, kind of our idea topic, annual conference topic is priority, and it's an evaluation of the 50-year run of the unreached people group paradigm. And so it just seems really fitting, Rebecca, to have you on the call. I met your father multiple times earlier in my career and was very much inspired by him. Could you tell us a little bit, though, not about your dad, but who you are and what your ministry background is?
Well, I'm so honored to be with you today, and I'm really glad to have this opportunity to share what's really close to my heart. About the time my father did his famous talk in 1974, 50 years ago, at Lausanne, he came back and shared all of the results with his 4 daughters. I'm the second daughter. And it just struck me and really captured my vision for my life. So subsequently, I got married. I went to the Edinburgh conference in 1980, and I still have the Bible where I signed in it a commitment that my entire life would be about a church for every people group. So since that time, my husband and I spent many years in the Muslim world. We helped to start Frontiers, and my husband was the international director for 10 years of that organization. During that time, we moved to India because there were 200 million Muslims in India, and we were wondering why they were so overlooked even by our own agency. And we were sort of shocked by what we found in India, and so that sort of catapulted me in the direction of doing my father's analysis that he had done for Lausanne and seeing where we were really at in terms of people groups that had no indigenous church, which was his original data was based on people groups with no indigenous church movements of any kind. He called it the Final Frontiers, and then it had gotten sort of clouded a bit since then, but maybe I can explain more of that later. But anyway, so that's what I've been doing for the last 7 years or so.
Well, I feel like I'm with missions royalty. I'm sure that might be off-putting to you because, as a servant who, has just given her life to this, but your dad, the history, Frontiers, it's just a real blessing to be with you today, Rebecca. Listen, there's a publication, you and I have already been talking about it, that's coming out soon called The Great Progress of the Gospel and the Remaining Frontier Missions Task. We're going to talk a little bit about some of that data today, but tell us about this booklet. Why'd you put it together?
Well, we put it together partly because it's the 50th anniversary of the original analysis, and we had learned so much by looking at the data over the last couple of years. The most amazing thing is that we've probably made more progress in advancing the gospel around the globe in the last 50 years than in all the time up until that point in history. So we've just lived through the most incredible advance of the gospel in history. That is shocking. What we realize is even though the population of the world has doubled, so 1974, 4 billion people, now 8 billion people, that we have gone from 60% of the world being in that category of people groups with no indigenous churches, 60% of the world, down to only 25% of the world. So About a third of the original unreached people groups, which was a category that was explained later by a 2% Christian, which is actually a lot higher than what my father originally set. But a third of those people groups are now reached people groups. They have gone past 2% evangelical. Another about third, a little bit less than a third, have movements to Christ, have indigenous churches in them, but they still haven't reached the 2% mark. So, but they have churches, so they no longer fit the frontier people groups category. Frontier people groups being those that have no progress of the gospel at all, where you can't go and partner with somebody because there's not a Christian community to partner with. And so if you compare the original data that my father came up with today's data of which people groups have no churches, it's gone from 60% of the world's population down to 25%. This is really incredible. In fact, it's gone from a situation where for every Christian there were 12 people, every committed Christian there were 12 people in a frontier people group, and now for every committed Christian in the world, there's only 2 people in a frontier people group, because evangelicals have actually increased by 500% during that same time period. So it's really, really amazing. I think some people get discouraged because they look at the actual numbers and they say, oh, yes, it's gone down, but not by a significant amount. But they don't take into account that the population of the world has doubled. So the actual percentage of the world's population has gone down significantly. And it's just incredible.
So when you're talking about these numbers, are you talking about raw population numbers? Are you talking about percentages of people groups?
We're talking about raw population of the world, but in terms of which people groups have been taken off the list, we're looking at the people groups themselves and seeing if there's an indigenous church movement there. If there is, then they're no longer a frontier people group. If it's reached 2% of the population, which is 2 out of every 100 people, a very large amount. In our county, we have 100,000 people. That would be 2,000 evangelical Christians in our county to get to 2%. So it's actually a large number before they're no longer an unreached people group. So the frontier people groups are the least reached of the unreached people groups. They're that category where there's no progress of the gospel. But what we need to understand is that the number of languages, even though the population of the world has doubled, the number of languages has not increased significantly. In fact, some languages have been lost. Also, the number of people groups has not increased significantly. They're just getting bigger. And so if you look at the people groups that are now in the kingdom, so to speak, they're on their way, they have indigenous churches and stuff, that amount by population has decreased from 60% to 25%. It's a significantly less number. It's like 5,000 people groups instead of 17,000 in 1974, it was 17,000, and now it's 5,000. But there's some really large ones left. And one of the things I was trying to show in the booklet, which may not be obvious to most people, is that if you look at the frontier people groups, 80% of the population of all the frontier people groups are in just less than 300 groups, 300 groups that are larger than 1 million. If we go and we manage to start indigenous movements to Christ in those 300 groups, I think right now it's 294, but it changes a little bit depending on populations growing and stuff. But if we just started movements to Christ, indigenous church planting movements in those 294 groups, we'd take care of 80% of the remaining frontier task. There'd be very little left.
I assume these are Joshua Project numbers. Is that where you're getting these from?
Yes. Almost all of our numbers come from the Joshua Project. There's a fantastic webpage called joshuaproject.net/frontier/interactive with a map of all the frontier people groups on it. And you can sort by languages. You can say, wow, these are the languages that we need the most missionaries to learn. These are the locations in the world. 70% of the frontier people groups are in South Asia, for example, by number and by population. So it's really the bulk of the task is in South Asia, and most of the rest of the task is in the Muslim world. So even though a lot of the people in South Asia are Muslims, all across Pakistan, North India, and Bangladesh, there's hundreds of millions of Muslims in South Asia. But then the rest of the frontier task is in the Muslim world. In fact, over 50% of the remaining frontier people groups are Muslim groups, and about 42% are Hindus. So the other thing that we need to understand is that we haven't effectively learned how to reach Muslims and Hindus. We've done really, really well on the tribal groups. We've done fantastic on the animistic groups. A lot of the progress happened in China and in Buddhist groups and in animistic groups. But and there's beginning to be a lot of progress among Muslim groups, especially in places like Indonesia, where the number of Muslims that don't have any kind of indigenous movement in their people group has dropped from 250 million to 50 million. That means 200 million of the Muslim people groups in Indonesia now have church movements among them, movements to Jesus among them. So that is huge. It's incredible progress. But South Asia is lagging. In fact, it's sort of interesting that India itself, which has 50% of the remaining frontier peoples, and by population and by count, has had about 2.5% to 3% Christian for a very long time. So even though there are big movements to Jesus, the population is growing so fast, 1.4 billion people, which is the amazing thing about it is that's almost exactly the same population as the continent of Africa. And I was looking it up the other day and I realized, wow, the number of languages in India is roughly equivalent, if not greater, than the number of languages in Africa. And the population is the same. But people will do things like they'll send one couple to India and one couple to Nigeria and one couple to Kenya and one couple, they look at countries instead of looking at the size of the country and the complexity of the task. Anyway, to me, it's very enlightening. It's like a big aha that I didn't even understand, because we were working in North Africa and we went there because it was the solid blue, slice on the pie chart that my father developed. And so now I've developed new pie charts which show the areas that are most needed. And India, I don't know if people are going to be able to see this, but India has the highest percentage of frontier people groups of any large area of the world. The highest percentage, this dark blue area. But all of that will be in this booklet that people will be able to download. And we hope that they just spread it far and wide as a PDF or they print it up. We will also have hard copies that they can order, and we're glad to send them to Missio Nexus and Lausanne and any other place that's willing to hand them out.
So, Rebecca, the word unbelievable is in the title of the booklet, The Unbelievable Progress of the Gospel and the Remaining Task. And I think it's Habakkuk 1:5. Look at the nations and watch. I'm going to do something in your day that you would not believe, even if I were to tell you. Now, it's not exactly a missions context, but it does definitely speak to God doing unbelievable things. And I think we can absolutely celebrate his grace and mercy in the spread of the gospel over the last 50 years. And yet, there is a task remaining. And can you talk about where we're sending our missions dollars and people primarily right now?
Yes. Yeah, and this is pretty understandable. About 96% of global workers, so in my father's original analysis, he was studying where the United States was sending people, but now a lot of people are coming from the other countries, from Latin America and even Oceania and places like that. And 96% of them are going to work with Christians in other countries. 96%. So they're going to the reached people groups of the world. In many cases, these reached people groups still have a lot of non-believers in them. They could be as many as 98% non-believers and still be considered a reached people group. So they're going to, like, the bulk of Latin Americans are going to North America. The bulk of Africans that are leaving the continent are going to Europe and North America. They're not really going into the Muslim world. They're not going, and it might even be hard for them to get into places like India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and places like that. So part of the problem is we need to actually figure out ways to connect with these frontier people groups. They have no progress for a reason, and that's because they have very little contact with believers, and it's not easy for believers to get into the countries that they're in. So that's equally true for people from the global south. I am so encouraged that Indonesians, for example, Indonesian Muslim background believers are even going to places like Malaysia, where the language is very similar. And a lot of the people in India are beginning to realize that they can go, they have to be careful because there's all these laws in India about conversion and stuff like that. And they can, of course, be persecuted if they try to win people to Christ. Whereas we just get kicked out of the country, but they get actually persecuted. But they're beginning to realize that they need to reach the castes, and that it's not an automatic thing. If you can have a church in every single last village in India and only be reaching the Dalit or outcast level, which is where most of the church movements are involved, are spreading. And so, unlike most countries of the world, the village in most countries of the world is one people group. So like in tribes, if there's a village, that's one people group. In India, every village is divided into multiple people groups because they divide on the basis of vocation. So it's a little bit hard for us to understand. I didn't really understand it until we moved there. But, all the street sweepers and the butchers and anybody that deals with blood, or like nurses or anything like that, they're all outcast people. And then you go up to the next level and it's people like farmers and weavers and people that have clean jobs. And then as you go higher, it gets more academic. And then the Brahmins, of course, are like the priestly caste. Anyway, so in a village, you have to have all of these levels because you have to have all of these professions. So if you have a church, it might be only reaching one or two of these levels, and people groups not touching.
One of the data points in the booklet talks about the multiplication of believers versus population growth. And it basically indicates that we're losing ground with 25% of the world, and these would be the frontier people groups. I assume that's because those groups are growing. Is that correct?
Right. It's because those groups are growing very quickly, but the number of Christians in them is so small, in fact, sometimes non-existent. 0%, is all we know, that the population of non-Christians is growing much faster than the population of Christians. In the other 75%, which includes the unreached people groups that have movements established, in every case where there's an established indigenous movement, as far as we can tell, the Christians are growing faster than the population. So that's almost the definition of a movement, actually, that you can't say there's a movement going unless it's growing faster than the population. So we're gaining ground. The gospel is gaining ground just about everywhere. There are a few exceptions of places where the church is sort of being overrun by secularism and atheism. So there are a few places like that, but surprisingly not many. So even in places where people are deciding they're no longer nominal Christians and now they're going to become agnostic, we didn't really count them as true believers anyway, in a sense. So they're not really changing the whole dynamic. But we're seeing if there are genuine, we include in the evangelical Christians like charismatics, anyone who feels you need to be born again, that you need to have a personal relationship with Christ, and you need to be telling other people about it. Pretty much we include those active, devoted Christians. And those are growing wherever they are well established.
One of the things that I often hear when I speak to groups, in fact, it just happened last week, is that, well, hey, with diaspora, immigration, migration, this problem's going to take care of itself. What are your thoughts about that? That kind of a question.
Well, unfortunately, of the unreached people groups, the total unreached people groups, only 4% of them are in any diaspora situation. But of the frontier people groups, it's 2.5%. And when I looked into it, I was like, so where are these people going? Well, for the most part, the Muslims from India, for example, and from Pakistan, they're going to Dubai. They're going to other Muslim countries. The big percentage of Moroccan Arabs that are outside of the country are in places like Egypt. There's more than 1 million of them in Egypt. So they're not exactly going to places that they will automatically encounter believers. It is true, like my sister lives near Detroit, and they've got big populations of Iranians and Yemenis and a lot of different people groups. So there are places that you can go and encounter frontier people groups, but there aren't many places where there's a significant community. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that often the people that are coming here are trying to get away for some reason from their home country. Now, that's not always true. Sometimes they're just here to send money back. But if they're trying to get away, then they are not well equipped to become a believer and influence their family network that they came from or their people group. And even if they do want to influence them, most of them do not want to go back. If they've made it to a country where there's a lot more prosperity, and a lot of these frontier people groups are not very prosperous. That's not true in India, actually, where a lot of the really high-level castes are very wealthy, and they're completely committed to their people group. According to the Pew Foundation, less than 10% are even willing to consider marrying outside of their people group. But the other ones that come here that come to Europe or come to the United States are so happy to have gotten into our country, they're not going back. This even happens with Christians that come from Africa and study at Fuller. I think at one point they had, these scholars that came every single year, and only one of them had gone back in 20 years or something to the country that they came from. So it's really hard to influence the core groups from just using migrants or diaspora situations. I think we should try, but it's not sufficient. It's not a problem that's going to go away. And they're not globalized. This idea that everybody's sort of becoming a globalized culture, and, if they can speak English, then they're just like us. It's just not true. And it's almost as if their protection of their identity is getting stronger because they feel more threatened. So you can go online. I was looking up the Arain, who are a people group that are in a Muslim people group that are in Pakistan predominantly, more than 10 million of them in Pakistan. And I was surprised to find online this website, when can you call yourself an Orion and when can you not call yourself an Orion? And there's all these arguments going on, do I qualify anymore or am I out, and it, it's fun, it's fun to really engage with people's sense of peoplehood, because it's sort of not a thing in America. It's not like I'm German background, so I feel like I'm a German, you know, uh, American, no, you know.
Well, you probably would say it's not a part of the majority culture worldview, but I think when you get into minority groups, it's probably a little bit different that way.
Yeah.
It is. And we have a lot of Sikh people here in our county. And so we've attended some of the gurdwaras and stuff when they have outreaches into the community. And one thing we noticed is that they have factions. They're like, whatever you do, don't go to that gurdwara over there. You have to come to ours because we are the ones who really believe the right thing. And so, that happens with Christians overseas too, where it's like, oh, you have to come to our Baptist church, don't go to that Presbyterian church. But the fact of the matter is, it's not easy to then winning people here than to impact their people group back in the Punjab.
Yeah.
It just doesn't translate back.
Yeah, every church we work with, we encourage them to lift their eyes. Who are the people groups that God has brought to your doorstep? Might they be a link to an unreached people group overseas, perhaps? But your point is well taken. We're not going to finish the Great Commission just by focusing on the diaspora peoples. Now, again, by all means, Acts 17, God is controlling the migration of peoples so that some might seek him and we should pursue them.
Yes.
But we can't stop sending. Yes, they're coming to us, but we still have to go to them. I think that's really important. So,
Yeah.
Rebecca, how can we best pray and focus together as the body of Christ to pursue these frontier groups? What does that look like?
Well, we're really trying to get people we've started 2 prayer campaigns. One, which is for the 35 or so frontier people groups that are larger than 10 million in size each. And we have this wonderful, it's called Pray for the 31 Largest Frontier Peoples, because when we first did it, there were only 31 groups that were larger than 10 million. Now there's 35. But an entire billion people are in just those 35 groups, 1 billion people. So half of the entire Frontier Mission population is just in those 35 groups. So we're trying to get everyone to pray. There's a great app that was created by Muslim background believers in Albania called blessfrontierpeoples.org, which you can get on your phone, and it will give you a group to pray about every day. You can go to go31.org and order booklets or just download them free of charge in a PDF form. We're trying to get people to pray. We're also trying to get people to pray for the 300 largest frontier people groups, because we believe that when people pray, God calls people out of that. That when they pray, they get really concerned. They get wondering who else is praying for. Is anybody going? And so we're trying to start a pray for the 300 largest frontier people groups movement as well. And John Robb, I don't know if you know him, but anyway, John Robb is helping because he knows all these global prayer movements that are just praying all the time. And he's like, okay, guys, it's time to pray for these largest frontier people groups. The other thing that I think is really important, and I'm talking to some anthropologists about this, some missiological anthropologists, is how to help people that are coming from the global south to get into these countries, and how to help them learn foreign languages and stuff, because we have a lot of training in the West. We have a long history of trying to give up our own culture and learn another culture. But Daryl Whiteman, who's one of the leading missiological anthropologists, pointed out that he found out that the Chinese missionaries that are going on the back to Jerusalem, so they're trying to go to the Muslim countries that are to the west of them, that they rarely stay longer than a year and a half. They're just completely stunned by being in cultures that are so completely different than their own. And it's very hard for them, and they burn out very quickly. So I feel like one of the ways that we can help is by encouraging them to say, yeah, it's really, really difficult. It's horribly hard for us. It's horribly hard for anybody from any culture to go and to learn a new language and to figure out how to educate your children. What country are they going to end up in when they grow up? All of these issues, I feel like there's insufficient. We sort of feel like, oh, people from the third world, it's going to be easier for them, from the global south. Hey, they're used to living without electricity half the time. But those are very small, minor things. The cultural distance and the language, completely different language families and stuff is just as difficult for them as it is for us.
As we land the plane here, when will the booklet come out, and where's the single best place to get it?
So we're going to link it to joshuaproject.net/frontier/great progress. We're going to link it to their website so people can just go there and get the booklet. There'll be other ways to get it. You can probably get it at go31.org as well, where we have a lot of our materials. But we just hope that it really goes viral. I feel like people get discouraged when they talk about unreached peoples because they feel like we haven't made any progress. They feel like there's a huge number and we can never do anything, when we've actually made incredibly great progress just by revealing which people need help. And we're continuing to make incredible progress. And so once they know that we've made much progress and that there's so few groups left compared to when we started 50 years ago, I find that people all over the world get very enthusiastic. In fact, some of the people that I've talked to in Africa and places like that are like so thrilled that they might be able to finish the task the task of starting indigenous churches, not of winning everybody in the world to Christ, but the task of starting indigenous churches in all the people groups of Africa. They might even be able to finish that task. So it's very encouraging to them to have this information.
And what date do you think that is going to be up on the Joshua Project website?
It's already up there on in a draft form. So it's going to change. And every time we have an update, we'll put the latest one up there. But certainly by the time this podcast gets out, it should be available in the more final form. So,
Well, I'm going to close this out with a quote here. I don't know who said it, but it aligns with Revelation 5 and 7. The
yes.
Great Commission's fulfillment is not impossible. It is inevitable.
Yes. And I think you need to remember that every tribe, tongue, and ethne nation is going to be before the throne. So even if we want to give up on the idea of people groups, God isn't going to give up. He made a covenant to bless all the families of the earth, and that's what he's going to do.
Thank you, Rebecca, for being on the Mission Matters podcast. Appreciate you. Look forward to seeing many people download this and pray through it. You have a blessed rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really honored to be asked.
Before you go, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership of 1615 and Missio Nexus. Check out 1615.org and missionexus.org for more resources on the mission of God and the matters of the mission. The Mission Matters podcast is hosted by Matthew Ellison, president of 1615, and Ted Essler, president of Missio Nexus.